My name is Lyra. I was 16 when my mother decided I had become a problem that needed to be fixed. We lived in a town that called itself peaceful, but operated like a microscope. Small, southern, white-fenced and whisper-filled. Murmur, Alabama. The kind of place where difference was tolerated only if it apologized first. My difference was visible. A sprawling patch of pigment across my left shoulder and upper arm, the shape of it like an ink spill no one could mop up. I was born with it. Some doctors called it vitiligo. Some thought it was scarring from a prenatal skin condition. All I knew was that it never hurt me, until people started to act like it did. Growing up, I was taught to cover. Long sleeves in the summer, cardigans over prom dresses. Even as a child, I understood the tightness in my mother's jaw when someone's eyes lingered too long on my skin. It wasn't about my comfort. It was about hers. And theirs. The people who flinched when I reached for something on a shelf. The neighbors who asked quietly if it was contagious. The teachers who called me brave for giving presentations in front of the class, as if simply being visible was an act of war. But something shifted when I turned 16. I got tired of hiding. Tired of melting in fabric designed to disguise. That summer, I wore a blue spaghetti-strap dress to church. It wasn't a protest. I just liked the way it felt, how the wind touched my bare skin like it wasn't afraid of me. I caught my reflection in the glass doors as we walked in, and for the first time I thought I looked radiant. Not despite the patch, but with it. As if my skin had written something holy across my shoulder and dared the world to read it. My mother noticed. Of course she did. Her hand clamped around my wrist the moment we stepped into the building. She didn't say anything right then. But the silence was colder than any reprimand. That night at dinner, she finally spoke. Not in anger, but in something worse. Shame disguised as concern. She told me I was making people uncomfortable. That I had acted like no one could see. That I was too proud for a girl with a mark. Like that. She said it like she was reading from a script someone else had handed her. Like she had rehearsed the words and thought they might come out gentle. But they didn't. They split me open. I nodded through the rest of the meal. Quiet, obedient, the good daughter with bad skin. The next morning, 2 strangers arrived at our front door. They wore uniforms that weren't quite police, weren't quite medical. Their van had no logo, just a government plate and tinted windows. They said they were part of a behavioral support program for at-risk youth. My mother called them specialists. I asked if I was being arrested. They laughed. One of them said, "You're being helped." I wasn't allowed to pack. They gave me 30 minutes to change and collect a toothbrush. My mother watched from the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. I wanted to ask her why she didn't just talk to me. Why she thought I needed correction for walking through the world without shrinking. But I didn't say a word, because deep down I already knew. She didn't want me to suffer. She wanted me to conform, to soften, to make her life easier. And I had failed her. The ride was long and silent. They didn't let me have my phone. No music, no windows down. Just highway and heat and the echo of my mother's voice in my head, telling me I had embarrassed her. That I had walked into God's house with a body too loud to be holy. I kept thinking, I didn't even do anything. I just wore a dress. But in Murmur, a girl like me wearing a dress she feels beautiful in is a threat. Confidence is rebellion. Joy is dangerous. We drove for hours. Past towns I didn't know, fields that blurred into a horizon I couldn't recognize. When we finally pulled into the facility, it looked like a converted church. No sign, no people, just concrete and silence. They opened the door and told me to step out. And I did. Because I didn't know yet what it meant to be locked away for the sin of loving your own body. I didn't know yet what they would do to try and strip that love out of me, but I would learn, very quickly. It was nearly midnight when they came for me. I had been asleep, or maybe just drifting close to it, my window cracked open, letting in the thick summer air and the sound of cicadas. The hallway light flicked on first, then the knock at my bedroom door, too polite to be urgent, but too steady to ignore. My mother's voice followed, thin and firm, telling me to get dressed. That was all she said. No explanation, no urgency in her tone, just a command wrapped in quiet finality. I sat up, confused, rubbing my eyes, thinking maybe it was something to do with church or my grandmother. But the moment I saw the shadows move behind her, tall figures, uniforms, silence, I understood. Not the details, not yet. But something inside me fell hard and fast, like a floor collapsing under my ribs. They didn't let me speak. Not to her, not to them. They handed me a pair of shoes and a plain zip-up hoodie, said I wouldn't need anything else. I reached for my phone out of instinct, and one of them took it from my hand with such practiced ease that I realized he had done this before. I wasn't the first. That realization stayed with me as I walked down the hallway barefoot, the cold tile humming under my skin like a warning. My mother stood by the front door, arms crossed, eyes dry. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, like she'd finally done what had to be done, like she was relieved. I tried to catch her eye, just once, but she kept looking past me, as if seeing me as I was, confused, small, half-dressed, might undo her resolve. I wanted to ask her where they were taking me, why she thought this was the answer, what I had done to earn being taken like a secret in the dark. But I didn't ask. I already knew none of those questions would be answered, because this wasn't about understanding. It was about removal. They put me in the back seat of a black van with no markings. The windows were tinted too dark to see through. The air conditioning was on full blast, and I sat there shivering, arms crossed, my shoulder burning from the cold. No one spoke. Not to me, not to each other. They didn't need to. Their silence was loud enough to tell me everything. We drove for hours. I don't know how long exactly. My sense of time blurred between curves of road and flickers of highway, lights. I counted them like stars, something to hold on to. My stomach turned every time we slowed down, thinking we'd arrived. But then the van would keep going, and the dread would build again, higher, tighter, harder to swallow. I wasn't crying. I think part of me still didn't believe it was real. That this wasn't a dream or some elaborate punishment for wearing that blue dress to church, for smiling in public, for daring to act like I belonged in my own skin. We arrived just before dawn. The building didn't look like a prison, but it didn't look like a home either. It was tucked behind a row of trees, surrounded by a rusted fence that hadn't been painted in years. The gate creaked open like something out of a movie, and the gravel crunched beneath the tires as we pulled in. There was no sign, no lights on. Just a gray building with narrow windows and a door that seemed too small for what waited behind it. They told me to get out. I stepped onto the gravel barefoot, the stones biting into my feet. I didn't ask where I was. It wouldn't have mattered. Places like this didn't need names. They needed obedience and silence. Inside, the air was thicker than outside. Not hot, just dense, as if everything inside the walls had learned to hold its breath. A woman with a clipboard greeted us without a smile. She asked for my name, checked it off like I was a package being processed, then handed me a set of clothes folded tightly. Gray sweats, a plain t-shirt, socks, no shoes. I was led down a hallway that echoed too much and shown to a room with no windows, just a bed with a metal frame, a sink, and a mirror too scratched to see yourself clearly. The door shut behind me. No lock, but it didn't need one. The message was clear. You are not here to escape. You are here to change. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the clothes. My hands were shaking. My skin felt too tight, too loud, too exposed. I wanted to scream, to bang on the door, to ask them what exactly they thought was wrong with me. But I didn't. Because somewhere deep in my bones, I understood what this place was for. It was to make me forget the girl I had been. The girl who smiled too confidently, who wore blue like she wasn't broken, who stood in a church like she believed she had the right. That girl had been taken in the night. Without a bag. without a warning, without a goodbye. And they were going to make sure she didn't come back. The haircut happened on the second day. The first was for intake, for silence, for learning how to follow without asking. They kept us in our rooms mostly, no clocks, no phones, no way to measure time except the shift in footsteps down the hallway, and the muffled sound of doors opening and closing at uneven intervals. I counted 7 girls on my hall, or at least 7 different voices when meals were dropped off. No one spoke during those deliveries. It was part of the process, they said. The adjustment window. I remember that phrase clearly because it was the first time I realized they were trying to erase not just my name or my body, but my rhythm, my sense of what was mine. When the door opened that morning, a woman with pale blue gloves motioned for me to come. No words, just a gesture. I followed her down a narrow corridor with yellowed tiles and low ceilings. There were no decorations, no signs, nothing to indicate this was a place for people. The hallway smelled like bleach and something sour beneath it. We entered a room with a single chair bolted to the floor and a mirror that was not glass, but a dull metal sheet, like the kind in public restrooms where you can see yourself, but not really. She pointed to the chair. I sat. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't explain. She just pulled my hair into a tight bunch and began to shave. The sound of the clippers was louder than I expected, like a swarm of bees too close to my ears. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I stared at that distorted reflection and tried to hold on to what I could remember of myself. My hair had always been something I took pride in. Thick, chestnut brown, with a natural wave that curled at the ends when I let it dry in the sun. It was the one part of me no one ever asked me to hide. And now it fell in chunks to the floor, like pieces of an old life no one wanted me to keep. When she finished, she handed me a folded uniform. Gray slacks, gray shirt, both stiff and slightly too big. No mirrors in the dressing area, no shoes, just socks and plastic sandals. I slipped it on. On the chest, in faded embroidery, was a name that wasn't mine. Emily J. I stared at it, numb, waiting for someone to correct the mistake. No one did. The woman took my clothes and threw them into a bin without a label. She didn't speak again, just pointed toward another hallway and turned away. I walked back with the wrong name stitched across my chest and a scalp that felt raw under the cool air. The other girls saw me and didn't react. Some had shaved heads too. Some wore the same, gray. Some still had remnants of their former lives in their posture, but it faded with each passing hour. They didn't talk. Talking was monitored. The walls listened. The staff wore small earpieces and always seemed to appear when someone raised their voice too high or said a name that wasn't allowed. In group orientation, we were told the rules. We were participants, not residents. We were here to restructure patterns of entitlement and correct self-destructive behavior. The woman leading the meeting used words like realignment, attitude calibration, ego displacement. I didn't understand them all, but I understood what she meant. They thought confidence was a sickness, that pride in a body, like mine, was arrogance, that to walk through the world without shame was dangerous. Not to me, but to the order they upheld. Girls like me weren't supposed to smile unless spoken to. We weren't supposed to stand tall in our skin. We were supposed to blend, to lower our gaze, to thank them for letting us stay. By the end of the week, I answered to Emily J. Not because I believed it, but because refusal earned consequences. And I had already learned what those felt like. Extra chores, cold showers, a meal withheld without explanation, standing for hours with your hands behind your back and your eyes on the floor until your muscles screamed. They called it reflection. I called it quiet punishment. I stopped writing. There were no pens, no paper. I stopped speaking unless addressed. I folded towels, scrubbed floors, recited daily affirmations I didn't believe. I am lucky to be here. I am becoming better. I am grateful for correction. Each word chipped away at the memory of who I had been before the van, before the clipboard, before the razor. But beneath it all, something held on. Not anger, not hope. Something quieter. A coil of resistance that sat just under my ribs and refused to unravel. Every time I saw my reflection in the window at night, That smooth skull, that foreign name. I whispered my own name in my mind. Not aloud, never aloud, but enough to remember. I am Lyra. I wore blue. I smiled in sunlight. I am still here. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was more like a flicker, barely the hint of an expression, a twitch at the corner of my mouth during morning inspection. One of the girls in my unit, number 12, had tripped while we were lining up outside the meal hall, and something about the absurdity of her arms flailing in silence, the way everyone else pretended not to notice, hit something inside me. It wasn't joy, it wasn't mockery. It was a small rebellion of instinct, the ghost of a reflex I hadn't felt in weeks. But one of the staff caught it, a woman in a navy vest with a clipboard and a permanent frown. She didn't say anything in that moment. She just wrote something down, and I knew. They called me into the rec room after dinner. It wasn't really a room for recreation, just a bare space with folding chairs and a mounted camera in the corner. They made me stand in the center while 3 staff members sat against the wall, clipboards in their laps, waiting like judges. One of them read from a sheet of paper in a bored tone, listing my violation as inappropriate facial expression indicating entitlement. Another called it attention-seeking body language. They said it undermined the purpose of the program, that it was symptomatic of unprocessed pride. Then came the sentence. 3 days of corrective reflection, face to the wall, no speech, no movement unless instructed. Meals delivered cold, no eye contact with staff or peers. The wall they chose was in a narrow corridor behind the maintenance closet. No windows, no clock, just beige paint peeling in thin strips and a crack in the upper corner where a spider had built a web I wasn't allowed to look at. They called it detention. I called it disappearance. The first hour was the hardest. My legs ached almost immediately. The stillness, the silence, the sensation of being watched but ignored. It was suffocating. I kept replaying the moment. In my head, the almost smile, trying to convince myself it hadn't really happened. But the fact that I was there said otherwise. In that place, intent didn't matter. Only obedience. By the end of the first day, my knees were locking. My shoulders screamed. I had no concept of time, only the rhythm of food trays being slid onto the floor behind me. I wasn't allowed to turn around. I ate on my knees, in silence, chewing without tasting. I slept upright, leaning against the wall in intervals so short and fractured they didn't count as rest. No one spoke to me. No one asked how I was. They passed by like I was part of the building, an object under maintenance. On the second day, I started to hallucinate. I imagined voices whispering behind the walls, saying my real name, urging me to turn around and run. I imagined the blue dress, crumpled on the floor of my old bedroom, still holding the shape of my shoulders. I imagined my mother standing in church, looking proud that I was gone. The pain in my back turned into heat, then numbness. The ache in my feet became a pulse I couldn't control. Still, I didn't cry. I refused to give them that. Not out of strength, but because tears had become too expensive. By the third day, I started to forget. My thoughts came in pieces, scattered and incomplete. I counted cracks in the paint to stay anchored. I recited my name under my breath in fragments. Lie, raw, girl, smile, shoulder, real. It was like clinging to a thread at the edge of a cliff. I no longer felt like a person. I felt like a warning. A lesson the others were being taught by watching me disappear. When they finally released me, I could barely walk. My legs wobbled beneath me like newborn limbs. They gave me no words, no explanation, just a tap on the shoulder and a gesture toward the hallway. I limped back to my unit and the girls looked away. Not out of cruelty, but survival. If you looked too long at someone who had been broken, you risked becoming next. That night, I sat on my bed, back against the wall, and tried to remember how it had felt to smile without punishment. I couldn't. The memory was already fading. But something else remained. A question, a quiet fire. If a single flicker of joy could shake them, what would happen if I laughed? What would happen if I refused to go numb? They thought they had erased something in me over those 3 days, but they hadn't. They had only taught me how dangerous my light must be if they were that desperate to smother it. And somewhere, deep inside the pain, I began to plan. The hunger came gradually, like erosion. It wasn't just physical, it was layered, institutional, strategic. They didn't starve us outright. That would have been too obvious, too easy to condemn. Instead, they rationed the food in ways that felt mathematical rather than human. Breakfast was dry cereal without milk. Lunch, a piece of bread and a protein square that tasted like chalk. Dinner was something they called soup, a gray liquid with nothing inside it but the memory of vegetables. If you failed a behavioral check, didn't respond to a command fast enough, held eye contact too long, laughed or sighed or whispered, they'd reduce your portion or skip your meal entirely. They called it calibrated nutrition. We called it the slow punishment. By the second week, my stomach was always clenched. Not from pain, but from fear. I never knew which small thing would make them decide I didn't deserve to eat. My body began to shrink before I noticed. My hip bones pressed harder against the fabric of the uniform. My collarbones ached when I leaned forward. My thighs no longer touched when I sat cross-legged. My lips cracked. My hair, what was left of it after they shaved it, turned brittle, breaking off between my fingers like ash. I learned to move slowly, to conserve, to chew longer so the food seemed like more, to keep water in my mouth for a moment before swallowing so it would trick my brain. But none of it was enough. The collapse came during cleanup duty. We were scrubbing the baseboards of the dorm hallway with toothbrushes, backs hunched, knees digging into the tile. I remember the sound before anything else. The soft thud of my body hitting the floor, followed by gasps that weren't allowed to be spoken aloud. I didn't feel the fall. I just remember the cold against my cheek and the distant sound of my name, not my real name, but the one stitched across my chest. Emily J. They dragged me into the medical room, which was just a supply closet with a cot and a monitor that beeped once every few seconds like it had somewhere better to be. Nurse with tired eyes checked my pulse, blood pressure, and hydration levels. She didn't speak much, just wrote something on a clipboard and left. Then one of the supervisors came in, a man I had seen before, tall, clean-shaven, with a voice that made everything sound like policy. He stood over me while I lay curled on my side, weak and shaking, and delivered his verdict in a tone flat enough to scrape bone. He said beauty wasn't for me. He said girls like me, marked, difficult, overinflated by false pride, had no business seeking desirability. That hunger, in all its forms, was a reminder of my place. He called me spoiled. He called me broken. He said I needed to remember that beauty was a privilege, not a right, and that I had forfeited it the moment I stopped hiding what made people uncomfortable. Then he left, and the lights stayed on, and I lay there, surrounded by the sterile smell of bleach and disinfectant, trying to decide if my body belonged to me anymore. It didn't feel like it did. It felt like something they were trying to wear down into silence, something they wanted to make small enough to fold into a corner and forget. I stayed in that room for 2 days. They gave me water, half a sandwich, some multivitamins. They didn't explain the change. Just enough to get me upright again. Enough to keep me from dying, not out of mercy. Out of convenience. When I returned to the dorms, the other girls looked at me differently. Not with pity, but with caution. Like I'd crossed a line and come back altered. Maybe I had. Something inside me had curled in on itself, like a fist or a flame, and refused to be extinguished. They hadn't beaten me. They'd exposed me. To myself. I looked in the mirror that night, the warped piece of metal above the sink, and I said my name quietly. Not Emily J. Lyra. My name. My real one. I said it over and over until the sound no longer felt foreign. Until I could almost see the girl I had been before the van, before the uniform, before the rules. I traced the scar on my shoulder with one finger, gently, like a signature, and whispered, "This isn't shame. That was the moment I stopped asking for their approval. They had tried to teach me that beauty was not for me. What they didn't understand was that I no longer needed beauty. Had something else now. I had truth. It started in whispers, just barely above breath. At night, when the building was silent and the fluorescent hallway lights buzzed like dying insects behind the glass, I lay on my cot and mouthed words I thought I'd forgotten. I didn't even mean to. The first line came to me like a memory. Uninvited but familiar, pulled from somewhere before the van, before the haircut, before the silence had nested so deep in my throat I'd forgotten the shape of sound. It was a line from a poem we'd read in 7th grade, something about dust and flowers and hands reaching for light. I didn't know why it surfaced, but it came back like a promise, so I let it stay. The next night, I said it again. This time, with sound soft and broken, as if my voice was a limb I hadn't used in weeks. My throat tightened around the vowels, unused to forming meaning, but the words slid out, one after another, and I lay still in the dark and waited for someone to tell me to stop. No one did. That gave me courage. Soon I began to recite more. Bits of poems, lyrics I half remembered, lines from old books. I spoke them to the ceiling, to the cracked tile above me, to the air that still felt thick with everything I'd been forced to swallow. I whispered numbers, multiplication tables, phone numbers from a life outside these walls, even the Fibonacci sequence as far as I could go. Something about the structure calmed me. It reminded me that the world was bigger than the rules inside, this building. That there was order somewhere beyond this place, and rhythm and beauty that no one could confiscate. The more I spoke, the more I remembered. I remembered the way I used to read aloud to myself in the mirror as a child, practicing, accents and voices, imagining I was on stage. I remembered the way my father used to quiz me on state capitals during long drives, how I used to sing the answers like a song. I remembered the way my voice used to sound before it was reduced to a whisper of obedience, and I wanted it back. So, one night I said my name. At first, it barely came out. Just breath. Just the ghost of sound. Lyra, my real name. Not the one they'd stitched onto my chest or barked during roll call. Mine. I said it again, louder, and then again, until it filled the room, bounced off the walls, settled into the ceiling tiles. It was the first time in months that I heard something in this building that didn't belong to them. Something that was mine. A sound they hadn't created, approved, or scripted. That night, I slept without waking. I began to speak more openly during the day, in small, controlled ways. I counted under my breath while folding laundry, muttered poetry while sweeping the hall, whispered names of constellations while wiping down windows that never opened. No one noticed at first. Or maybe they did and didn't care, as long as I didn't say anything that challenged them directly, but each word I spoke was a seed, a stitch, a crack in the silence they'd trained into us. Some of the other girls started to watch me differently. One of them, number 6, started humming while mopping. Another, number 19, began to mouth words during mealtimes. No one spoke aloud to each other, not yet. That was still too dangerous. But something was shifting in the air. Our voices had begun to wake up. I still remember the day I spoke in front of a staff member. It wasn't planned. We were outside, pulling weeds from the narrow strip of dead grass along the back fence, and I saw a bee land on a flower. I whispered the word bee out loud without thinking, and one of the supervisors turned to look at me. She stared, waiting, for me to apologize, to shrink. But I didn't. I just met her gaze and said it again. Bee. As if naming it gave me power over something small and alive. She turned away without a word. From that moment, I knew I had found the beginning of my way out, not a physical exit. That would come later. But the first real escape is the one that happens inside your body, when the thing they tried to bury begins to speak again. When the voice they tried to erase returns stronger, clearer, louder than they ever allowed. I kept going. I whispered, facts. I told stories. I recited dreams. And every night I said my name, Lyra, 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 until the sound of it felt like a flame against the cold. I didn't scream. I didn't break rules. I just refused to forget myself. And that, I realized, was the worst thing I could do in their eyes, because silence was their language, and I had remembered mine. I was 22 when I stood on the edge of the property again, 6 years after they took me there in the back of a van with no explanation, no goodbye, no mercy. The building looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that was because I was no longer the girl they broke apart inside it. The fence was still there, rusted, curling in on itself like even the metal had grown tired of holding that place together. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the sidewalk. The windows were boarded up, some with old plywood, some with sheets of metal that had started to peel away. A sign nailed crooked near the entrance read, "Closed until further notice." But I already knew it wasn't coming back. And I had made sure of that. Buying the land wasn't easy. It took years of saving, of research, of silence. The facility had shut down 2 years after I left. Allegations, lawsuits, whispers from girls who finally found the strength to speak louder than their fear. I never testified. I didn't need to. I had other plans. I watched it from a distance, while building my own name, my own money, my own power. And when the last legal owner folded and the land was quietly listed under a generic commercial zoning tag, I called a lawyer and made an offer. No one asked why I wanted it. No one remembered my name. That was their mistake. When the paperwork was signed and the deed transferred, I drove out there alone. I sat in the car for almost an hour, watching the place through the windshield like it might vanish if I looked away. My heart didn't race. I didn't cry. I just felt still. Like everything had come full circle without asking for permission. The demolition team didn't ask questions either. I paid them in cash, showed them the boundaries, and told them I wanted every wall down to the last foundation tile gone. No salvaging. No repurposing. Just dust. On the morning the machines arrived, I stood across the street in the early light and watched the first wall crumble. The sound wasn't loud. It was soft, almost graceful. The way rot finally gives up and folds into itself. One by one, the rooms came down. The corridor where I stood facing the wall for 3 days, the rec room where they read my charges like scripture, the bunk hall where we whispered names into the dark. Gone. When the last slab was reduced to rubble, I walked through the dirt. It was uneven, filled with broken nails and shattered concrete, but I stepped carefully, deliberately. I found the place where my bed used to be, or close enough to it, and stood there in silence. This time, not because I was told to, but because I chose to. My silence was no longer theirs. Then I started planting. I had already chosen the seeds. Wildflowers, mostly. Resilient things, sunflowers, marigolds, milkweed, echinacea, flowers that didn't care where they were planted, only that they had light. I didn't hire anyone. I did it myself, by hand, one patch at a time, over weeks. I dug the soil, turned it, fed it, placed each seed like a prayer. Every shovel of dirt was an act of reclamation. Every root was a story being rewritten. Neighbors pass by sometimes. They asked what used to be here, and I always answered the same, just something that needed to go. They smiled, nodded, moved on. No one pressed, no one remembered. But I did, and that was enough. By late spring, the first bloom opened, a single yellow daisy in the corner nearest where the gates once creaked. Then more followed. Soon the whole space was green and golden and growing like it had never known walls. Butterflies came, bees, children passed through the grass. And I sat on the edge of what used to be my prison, and I breathed. I installed a wooden bench in the center. No plaque, no explanation, just a place to sit and feel the wind. One afternoon, I brought a mirror out and placed it gently against a tree. A small one, the kind you'd find in a dorm room. I looked into it, at my face, at my shoulder, at the mark that once made strangers flinch and family retreat. I didn't hide it. I didn't adjust the angle. I smiled, fully, without fear, and then I whispered my name into the soil. Lyra, not to reclaim it, but to let the ground remember me differently. The morning of the park's opening, the sky was clean and sharp, the kind of blue that makes everything below it feel like it belongs. I woke up before the sun rose, not out of nerves, but out of reverence. I made coffee and drank it on the porch in silence, watching the light unfold across the grass like it was remembering how to touch the earth. I had chosen the date carefully, 6 years to the day since they took me away in silence. Not for symmetry, not for revenge, but because that day no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. I wore white, a dress I had found months earlier, and tucked away for this moment. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to prove anything. It just fit. It was soft and strong and moved when I did. It made my skin glow in the light, and it left my shoulder bare. On purpose. The mark was visible, sharp against the fabric. The thing they once said needed to be hidden now standing in the center of everything. I didn't cover it. I didn't explain it. I simply let it exist. Let it speak for itself. People began to gather slowly. Some were friends, some were strangers who'd read about the new park replacing the old facility. A few reporters came. There was no ribbon, no podium, no ceremony. Just me, standing in the place where I had once been silenced, now ready to speak with nothing over me. The wildflowers had bloomed fully, waves of yellow and violet dancing in the breeze like the earth was laughing quietly underfoot. The bench sat beneath the same tree where I had planted the mirror, now surrounded by clover and soft moss. When everyone had settled, I stepped forward. My feet sank slightly into the grass, and for a second I closed my eyes and remembered it. All. The hallway, the cold tile, the silence that pressed against my chest like a second skin, the hunger, the uniform, the way they had cut my hair like they were trimming away my voice. I remembered the names I had been called, the ones that weren't mine, the voice that had cracked and trembled until I taught it to sing again. Then I opened my eyes. Looked. Out at the people. And I spoke. My voice was clear, louder than I expected, but steady. I didn't have a speech. I didn't need one. The only words I had carried with me for this moment were the ones that had first kept me alive when everything around me tried to erase them. I said them slowly, not for effect, but so I could feel each one land. So the ground could hear them. So I could hear myself. No one has to hide. The words floated out into the wind, and I let them hang there. Not as defiance, but as truth. Not just for the girl I had been, but for every girl still standing in corners, every girl still waiting to be allowed into her own body again, every boy with a voice trembling at the edge of silence, every human being ever told to shrink to survive. There was no applause, just stillness. And then a softness moved through the crowd. A few people wept quietly. One woman reached out and touched the edge of a flower with both hands, like it was sacred. A child pointed at the mark on my shoulder and asked something. I didn't hear, and his mother smiled and nodded. A teenager pulled out her phone and began to type, quickly, like she was writing something she didn't want to forget. I walked through the park after that, alone. I didn't say much. Didn't need to. My body had already spoken. I let my hand brush the tops of the flowers as I passed, feeling the life I had made bloom from a place once built to kill spirit. No more concrete, no more steel beds, just earth, and light, and something new. Later, after the crowd had dispersed, I sat on the bench under the tree and removed my shoes. Pressed my bare feet into the soil, let the sun hit my shoulder, and I whispered my name again, not because I needed to prove it anymore, but because it sounded beautiful in the open air. Lyra, a name that was once a secret now spoke without apology, a name that no longer needed to hide.